The light turned green and the 7:47 bus to downtown Vancouver pulled away from the curb while Fiona Ashby was still 30 feet from the stop. She watched it go with the particular despair of someone who had calculated every minute of the morning down to the last second and still managed to lose. Her portfolio case was digging into her shoulder, her left heel had developed a squeak somewhere between her apartment door and the sidewalk, and the cold October air tasted like it about to rain. "No," she said. "To no one. To the universe. Not today." The universe didn't answer, it rarely did. The Marchetti Group's presentation was at 9:15. The 7:47 was the only bus that got her to the Burrard office tower with enough time to find the washroom, check her teeth, and stand outside the boardroom door looking like someone who had things under control. The next bus came in 22 minutes. She checked her watch again as if the numbers might rearrange themselves into something more helpful. They didn't. Fiona started walking. Not running. She had made the mistake of running in heels once, at a client meeting in 2021, and the memory still visited her at inconvenient moments. But she walked fast, portfolio slapping against her thigh, coffee she hadn't finished going cold in her hand, heels clicking on the wet sidewalk with the kind of urgency that made pigeons scatter. She was 1 block from the bus stop, trying to remember if she had packed her backup flash drive when she saw the girl. 8 years old, maybe 9. Brown coat too big for her, like she'd borrowed it from someone older. She was sitting on the low stone wall outside the Granville Island entrance, knees pulled to her chest, shoulders shaking in that particular way that meant she'd been crying for a while already, that silent, exhausted kind of crying where all the noise is gone and only the trembling is left. Every person on the sidewalk walked past her. A man in a North Face jacket, eyes on his phone. 2 women mid-conversation, not breaking stride. A cyclist who glanced over and kept pedaling. The whole city just flowed around her like water around a stone, and the girl sat there in the middle of it, invisible. Fiona looked at her watch, 7:53. She needed to cross 11 blocks in 20 minutes. She crouched down in front of the girl. "Hey," she kept her voice low and even, the way her mother had always spoken to frightened animals. "Hey, you okay?" The girl looked up. Her eyes were red, her nose running, and she had the expression of someone who had decided, somewhere in the last hour, that adults couldn't be trusted but was running out of other options. "I lost my dad," she said. Her voice was steady in that heartbreaking way kids get when they're trying very hard to be brave. "We were walking and he was on the phone and I stopped to look at the boats and when I looked up he wasn't there." "Okay." Fiona set her coffee down on the wall. She wasn't going to drink it anyway. "Okay, that's fixable. What's your name?" "Rosie Aziv, I'm Fiona." "Can you tell me your dad's last name?" "Whitmore." The girl wiped her nose with her sleeve. "Owen Whitmore." Fiona didn't recognize it, but Vancouver had a lot of people named Whitmore, and this wasn't the moment to analyze that. "What was he wearing?" "Gray jacket." "Dark gray, not light gray, and he has brown hair." "He's tall." Rosie paused, considering. "He always looks like he's thinking about something important." Fiona smiled despite herself. "Does he used to say he forgot where he put everything except his phone." Rosie's voice dipped slightly on the word mum, then steadied again. "He had the phone, so." Fiona glanced at the street. 11 blocks, 18 minutes now, probably. She looked back at Rosie. "All right, here's what we do. We go back to where you last saw him and we stay visible, okay? He's looking for you right now, I promise you that." Rosie nodded, stood up and took Fiona's hand with the complete and uncomplicated trust that only children and very good dogs have for strangers. They walked back toward the boardwalk, Fiona scanning every gray jacket in every direction, Rosie pointing out every detail she could remember about the exact spot where she'd stopped to look at the boats. It was the 3rd boat from the left, the blue and white one. She was very specific about this. Fiona asked a vendor near the entrance. No luck. She stopped a harbor patrol officer who said he'd keep an eye out and radioed it in. She called out once, "Owen Whitmore?" into the general vicinity, which made several people look up with expressions of mild concern and then look away. 7 minutes passed. Fiona was calculating whether she could still make a cab work when she heard someone running. He was taller than average in a dark gray jacket exactly as described, and he was scanning the crowd the way people do when they're trying to look controlled but aren't. His eyes were doing the particular work of a parent who has lost a child in public, checking faces, calculating distances, that specific focused terror. "Rosie." The girl let go of Fiona's hand and ran. He caught her like she was something irreplaceable, which she was. He crouched down and held her with the kind of grip that wasn't about comfort so much as reassurance. "I have you, you're here, this is real." And for a moment he closed his eyes and just breathed. Fiona stood a few feet back and looked at her shoes. It felt like witnessing something private. He stood up with Rosie still in his arms and turned. He had the kind of face that looked like it defaulted to serious, not unfriendly, just the face of someone who spent a lot of time thinking, as advertised, blue-gray eyes, a small scar near his left eyebrow. He looked at Fiona the way people do when they owe someone something and don't yet know how to say it. You found her, she found me, really. Fiona picked up her portfolio case. I just walked slowly. His phone rang. He glanced at it, then back at her with the expression of a man being pulled in 3 directions at once. I thank you, genuinely. You have no idea. I think I do a little. Fiona smiled. Go, she's okay. Rosie waved at her over his shoulder as he carried her away. A small, serious wave, 3 fingers. Fiona waved back, and then she looked at her watch, 9:04. The Marchetti presentation was in 11 minutes. She stood on the Granville Island boardwalk with cold coffee in her hand, and 11 blocks between her and the one contract that could actually fix everything. The 6 months of invoices sitting in her inbox, the subletted studio she'd moved into after the split with Marcus, the number she'd been doing in her head every night before sleep, adding and subtracting until it came out even. It never quite came out even. She hailed a cab. The driver made it in 9 minutes, which Fiona was going to think about every time anyone told her Vancouver traffic was unpredictable. The Harwick Tower lobby was all marble and intention. The kind of architecture designed to make people feel like they were in the presence of decisions. Fiona crossed it in her squeaking heel, told the security desk her name, and rode the elevator to the 14th floor, composing the most professional version of her apology in her head. The receptionist looked up when she arrived. Mrs. Ashby? I know, 9:15. You're actually fine. The woman smiled slightly. Mr. Whitmore had a family emergency. He just called to say he's running behind 15 minutes, maybe 20. Fiona blinked. Mr. Whitmore, head of development. He's leading the presentation review today. The receptionist was already gesturing toward the waiting area. Can I get you water, coffee? Fiona sat down very carefully. Owen Whitmore, head of development. She thought about Rosie, very specific about the 3rd boat from the left. She thought about gray jacket, not light gray. She thought about he always looks like he's thinking about something important. She thought about whether this was the universe's idea of a joke or an apology. The waiting area had 4 other people in it, all with the contained competitive energy of professionals who had prepared very hard. A man in his 40s with a printed binder, 2 women from the same firm, whispering. A younger man who kept checking his phone with decreasing subtlety. Fiona smoothed her skirt and opened her portfolio and did not think about the squeak in her left heel. She was still not thinking about it when the elevator doors opened and Owen Whitmore walked in. Still in the dark gray jacket, Rosie nowhere in evidence. He spoke briefly to the receptionist, nodded at something she said, and started down the hallway. Then stopped. He turned around slowly. Fiona stood up. They looked at each other across 14 feet of architectural neutrality. Huh, he said finally. Yeah, she said. A pause that lasted approximately 1 geological era. You're the architect, you're the dad. Something shifted in his face, not quite a smile, but in the neighborhood. He walked toward her, and she noticed that he walked the way people do when they've learned to move through spaces that belong to other people. Careful without being unsure. He extended his hand. Owen Whitmore, Fiona Ashby, I know. He held up the thin folder in his other hand. I read your portfolio on the drive over, in the car. I read everything in cars. Rosie thinks it's a character flaw. Rosie, Fiona said carefully, is 9 years old. She's also not wrong about most things. The not-quite smile got fractionally closer to being a smile. The reception room is this way. Can I ask you something? You can ask. The harbor patrol officer who radioed in the description. She used the phrase calm, professional, sensible shoes. He glanced at her feet. It was specific enough that I wondered. I was wearing different shoes when I made that impression, Fiona said. This one's developed a squeak. This time he actually smiled. It transformed his face the way good light transforms architecture. Suddenly you could see the whole thing. Come on, he said. Let's get you in front of a table. The review panel was 5 people, not 1, which was better in some ways and more complicated in others. Fiona had presented to groups before. She knew how to read a room where the skeptics sat, how to plant a question in a way that looked like genuine uncertainty. She spread her drawings on the long glass table and let the work do its first pass. Owen Whitmore sat slightly apart from the others, which she read as either seniority or deliberate distance. He listened the way people do when they've already formed an initial opinion and are deciding whether to revise it. She got through the site analysis and the massing diagrams and was reaching for the material samples when the woman directly across from her, mid-50s, reading glasses, the particular stillness of someone who had seen many presentations and been impressed by very few. Said Miss Ashby, "Your previous firm was Harrison & Cross. They closed last February." Fiona didn't look away from her. "Corporate restructuring, which is the polite version. The principal partners sold to an investment group and took the proceeds to somewhere with better weather." A small ripple of reaction around the table. "You've been independent since then?" "I've been building a client base since then." Fiona picked up the material sample she'd been reaching for. "Which is not the same thing as independent by choice, I realize. I'm not going to tell you it's been comfortable." She set the sample on the table. "But every decision in this proposal is one I made. No compromises to a senior partner, no second-guessing from a committee. You'd be getting exactly what you're looking at." The woman with the reading glasses looked at the sample for a moment. Then she looked at Fiona. "Fair enough," she said. "Continue." Owen Whitmore wrote something on the notepad in front of him. Fiona couldn't see what it was, but he'd stopped looking like he was deciding whether to revise his opinion. The presentation ran 40 minutes. At the end, the woman with the reading glasses thanked her, collected the material samples, and said they'd be in touch within 2 weeks. Fiona shook 4 hands around the table. Owen walked her to the elevator. "The Pemberton sightlines," he said, "in the north elevation. You accounted for the seasonal shadow shift, October to March. The adjacent building casts about 60% shade on that face." Fiona pressed the elevator button. "If you're putting any kind of green wall on the north elevation, you need to plan for it. Most proposals don't. He looked at the elevator doors. "Yours did." A pause. "How's Rosie?" Fiona asked. "At her grandmother's." He said it in the tone of a man who had made approximately 7 phone calls to arrange this in the past hour. "She wanted me to tell you thank you. She was very specific that I say from Rosie, not just from Dad, because apparently those are different things." "They are different things, yes." A pause. "I'm sorry you were late." "Because of her. Because of us, I wasn't late." The elevator arrived. I checked. The doors opened. Fiona stepped in and turned around. "For what it's worth," Owen said, and his voice had shifted into something less formal. "The harbor patrol officer was right. You were calm." "I wasn't calm," Fiona said. "I was calculating whether I could make a cab in 9 minutes, and I could." The doors closed. In the elevator, going down, Fiona allowed herself to breathe. She'd done the work. The presentation had landed. The rest was out of her hands. Her phone buzzed. A message from her neighbor, Janet, who watched her cat Biscuit on long days. "He knocked your aloe vera off the shelf again. He looks extremely unbothered. Should I be concerned?" Fiona typed back, "He's always unbothered. That's his whole personality. Thank you for existing." She walked out of the Harwick Tower and turned toward the water. The call came on a Tuesday, 10 days later. Not from the receptionist and not from the woman with the reading glasses. From Owen Whitmore directly, which she found out when she answered it without checking the number. "Miss Ashby, Mr. Whitmore, the panel voted this morning." A pause that lasted long enough for her stomach to do something unhelpful. "You're our first choice, pending contract terms. I wanted to tell you before the formal letter goes out." Fiona sat down on her studio floor. She hadn't been sitting on the floor. She'd been standing at her drafting table. But somehow the floor had become appropriate. "That's..." She stopped. "Thank you, you earned it." Entirely on the work. He said it like he needed her to know that. The sightlines, the material choices, the fact that you were honest about the last 18 months instead of pretending they didn't happen. "I thought about pretending," she admitted. "It occurred to me. Most people would have." A pause. "Rosie has been asking about you." Fiona looked at her drafting table at the half-finished elevation drawing. "She has? She wants to know if the architect lady is nice." He sounded faintly apologetic about this. "I told her I thought so. She said that wasn't very detailed and I needed to find out more. She sounds like a reasonable person. She's 9. She's terrifying." A pause. "There's a pancake place near Granville Island she's been asking to go to since the summer. She's currently framing it as essential to her emotional recovery from the lost incident, which I think is a slight overstatement, but I haven't been able to prove it." Fiona looked at the drawing on her table. Outside, the Vancouver rain was making its regular October case for itself. "When?" she asked. "Saturday. 10 o'clock if that works." "It works." Saturday morning was cool and clear in the particular way Vancouver sometimes offered as an apology for all the gray. Fiona arrived at the pancake place on Anderson Street at 9:54, which she was aware was early, and was halfway through reading the menu when the door opened and a small person in a red coat walked in ahead of Owen Whitmore and pointed at Fiona directly. "There she is," Rosie announced to the general restaurant. "That's the one." Fiona looked up. "That's me." Rosie sat down across from her with the decisive energy of someone who had been thinking about this for 10 days. My dad says you're an architect. What's that? I design buildings. What kind? Right now, a mixed-use development near False Creek. Before that, a community center in Port Moody. Before that, a lot of smaller things while I was working for someone else. Rosie considered this. Do you draw the buildings or do a computer do it? Both. The computer helps with the technical parts. But the ideas start on paper. I draw on paper, Rosie said, with the air of a professional confirming a shared credential. Owen sat down beside his daughter. He was wearing a different jacket today, dark blue, not gray, and he looked different out of a boardroom in a way that was difficult to precisely articulate. Less like someone waiting for a presentation to end. She's been preparing questions, he said. I can see that. I wasn't preparing, Rosie said. I was thinking. What's the difference? Fiona asked. Rosie appeared to genuinely consider this. Preparing is when you write it down. Thinking is when it just goes around. That's a better definition than I've heard from some adults. Rosie seemed satisfied by this and picked up her menu. The pancakes arrived with an unnecessary amount of maple syrup, which Rosie declared was the right amount and Owen declared was medically significant. They argued about this for 4 minutes with the relaxed, recursive energy of people who had argued about it many times before. Fiona ordered the same amount of syrup as Rosie, which Rosie noted as a point in her favor. Owen told her about the project, not in the formal way he'd spoken during the review, but in the way people talk when they're actually interested in something. The history of the site, what they'd hoped for, the 2 previous proposals that hadn't worked. He asked her questions and listened to the answers in the complete way that felt, in her experience, increasingly rare. Fiona told him about Port Moody, about the 18 months since Harrison and Cross, about the particular exhaustion of building something on your own without being entirely sure it was going to hold. She told him more than she'd intended to, which she noticed partway through and kept doing anyway. Rosie, for her part, ate 3/4 of her pancakes and then produced a small sketchbook from her coat pocket and began drawing what appeared to be a building. Is that for me? Fiona asked. It's for the project, Rosie said seriously, in case you need ideas. Owen looked at the ceiling briefly. She watched a documentary about Frank Lloyd Wright 2 weeks ago. Nothing wrong with a reference point, Fiona said. Rosie tore the page out of the sketchbook and passed it across the table with the no-nonsense manner of someone submitting a professional document. It was a building with a great many triangles and what appeared to be a garden on the roof. Fiona looked at it seriously and said, "The roof garden is actually very practical in Vancouver. I'll consider it." Rosie looked at her father. She said she'll consider it. I heard. That means she might use it. It means she's polite, Owen said. It means both things, Fiona said, and Rosie nodded firmly. They walked along the waterfront after, in the cold, clean air, Rosie running slightly ahead to investigate things. A seal that surfaced near the dock, a busker with a very small accordion, a dog of uncertain breed that allowed itself to be petted for exactly 12 seconds before reconsidering. Owen walked beside Fiona and they talked about small things. The neighborhood, a good coffee place he knew on Cartwright, the specific quality of October light in Vancouver that made everything look like a photograph someone had taken on purpose. How long have you been in the city? She asked. 6 years. We moved after. He paused. Rosie's mum passed. Rosie was 3. I needed somewhere that didn't have all the same geography. I'm sorry, Fiona said. She meant it and she didn't add anything to it, which felt like the right call. She's been incredible, he said, watching Rosie negotiate with the accordion dog. Rosie. She doesn't remember enough to grieve the way adults do, which is simultaneously a relief and the saddest thing I know. He paused. She draws a lot of pictures of houses. I asked her once why, and she said she was practicing for when we found the right one. Fiona looked at Rosie, who had crouched down next to the accordion dog and appeared to be explaining something to it with great seriousness. What's wrong with where you live now? Nothing's wrong with it. It's a perfectly good apartment. He said it with the particular flatness of someone who doesn't quite believe the thing they're saying. But Rosie has a list of requirements. A yard, a place to draw that isn't her bedroom, somewhere a dog wouldn't be against the rental agreement. The dog question seems urgent. It's been urgent for approximately 3 years. He smiled. She has strategic patience. Rosie came back with the slightly muddy knees that happen when children crouch on damp grass and the satisfied expression of someone who had accomplished something. His name is Biscuit, she announced. Fiona stopped walking. My cat is named Biscuit, she said. Rosie stared at her. You have a cat named Biscuit. I do. A pause. That's the same name. It is. Rosie turned to her father with the expression of someone who has just received confirming evidence for a theory they have been developing. She didn't say anything, which was somehow more significant than if she had. Owen looked at Fiona with a carefully neutral expression that was working very hard. "She's going to think this is meaningful, isn't it?" Fiona said. "It's a coincidence. She's 9. She's allowed to think coincidences are meaningful. She already thinks most things are meaningful. Good. That's a good way to be." Rosie tugged on her father's sleeve. "Can we see the boats again?" "The blue and white one is still there." They went to see the boats. 3 weeks later, the contract was signed. Fiona was standing at her drafting table at 7:30 in the morning, going over the site survey notes when her phone rang. Owen's name on the screen. "I'm looking at the preliminary drawings," he said, without preamble. "The ones you sent last night and the north elevation. The green wall placement." A pause. "The specifications account for winter light. October to March, I know. You mentioned it." Another pause, shorter. "I've been thinking about what Rosie said." "Which part?" "The part where she told me verbatim, Dad, she's the one who stayed. I asked her what that meant and she said, everyone else walked past me but she stayed." Fiona set down her pencil. "She's right," Fiona said finally. "She usually is." A pause that had a different weight to it than the ones before. "Fiona." It was the first time he'd used her first name outside of a formal introduction. "Owen, I would like to take you to dinner. Not with Rosie, which is not to say anything against Rosie, who is excellent company. But this would be a different kind of conversation." The Vancouver rain was going at the studio windows in its reliable October way. On the drafting table, the preliminary drawings showed a building that didn't exist yet, half idea and half fact, waiting for the rest of the decisions to be made. "I'd like that," she said. "Thursday." She heard him exhale, just slightly, just once, and there was something in it that she recognized. The particular relief of someone who has been carrying something carefully for a while and has finally set it down. They met at a small Italian place near Yaletown that Owen had apparently been to twice and memorized, because he ordered without looking at the menu and asked the server by name about the soup. Fiona found this mildly devastating in a way she did not examine too closely. They talked for 3 hours. About the project and then not about the project. About Vancouver in winter and what it did to people who weren't from here. About Port Moody and what it had meant to her to build something from scratch. About Harrison and Cross and the moment she had understood that the company was going to fail before the partners announced it. About the particular arithmetic of being a single person in an expensive city with an irregular income and a cat named Biscuit who had no respect for structural objects. Owen talked about Rosie with the concentrated attention of a man for whom parenthood had become the primary organizing principle of existence, which was, Fiona found, not a small thing to watch. "She drew another building," he said. "This one has a basement room specifically for geological samples. I asked where that came from and she said she wanted somewhere to keep rocks." "That's a library," Fiona said. "Just specifically for rocks. I'll tell her. She'll probably add it to the brief." Fiona laughed. It felt easy, which she noticed because it hadn't felt easy in a while. Outside, walking back toward the car, Owen stopped on the corner of Hamilton and Drake under a streetlight that was doing its best against the drizzle and said, "I've been thinking about the morning at Granville Island. It comes up. You were late for something. I could tell, even when you didn't say it." He looked at her steadily. "You still stopped. She was crying. A lot of people walk past crying children." "I know." Fiona looked at the wet pavement. "I couldn't." He nodded slowly, the way people do when something confirms a conclusion they've been approaching carefully from several directions. Then he said, "Can I tell you something that will sound like too much, maybe, for a first dinner? You can tell me." When I walked into the Harwick Tower that morning and the receptionist told me someone had found Rosie, a woman calm, sensible shoes, and then I walked into the waiting room and you stood up. He paused. "I already knew something, I think. Before I knew anything." Fiona looked at him for a moment in the drizzle and the streetlight, both of them slightly damp, the city doing its regular indifferent business around them. "That's not too much," she said. He smiled. "The one that transformed everything. Good." The weeks that followed were ordinary in the best possible sense, site visits and contractor calls, and the particular problem of the second-floor atrium that Fiona solved at midnight with a cold cup of tea and a very good pencil. Owen texted intermittently throughout the day with project questions that occasionally, gradually, became something else. Rosie sent 3 more building drawings via her father's phone. One of them had, in the bottom right corner, a small figure with dark wavy hair labeled Fiona Architect, which Fiona photographed and saved and did not mention to anyone. There were dinners. There was a Sunday at Granville Island with Rosie, who treated Fiona's professional opinion on boats with more seriousness than several people had treated her presentations. There was a Tuesday evening on Owen's apartment balcony after Rosie was in bed, drinking tea in the cold because neither of them wanted to go inside yet. "She asked me if you'd be at Christmas," Owen said. Fiona looked at the lights across the water. "That's a significant question." "I know. What did you say?" I said I hoped so. He turned to look at her. "I do hope so." The night sky above Vancouver had that faint luminous quality that cities give clouds, not quite dark, never quite bright. Somewhere down on the street, someone was walking a dog with a flashlight collar, a small moving star at street level. "I'd like that," Fiona said. Owen reached over and took her hand in the straightforward way of someone who has thought about it long enough and decided. His hand was warm against the cold air. Below them, the city went about its business, indifferent and enormous, full of people who passed each other every day without stopping, without looking, without seeing the small moments that change everything. One morning a woman had missed her bus and crouched down next to a crying child on a harbor wall, and nothing had been the same since, which was the most ordinary kind of miracle when you thought about it. The kind that starts with the specific, unremarkable, irreversible decision to stop.